At midday, in front of the Cecilia Medical Center, a man in the gray uniform of the cleaning crew knelt on the concrete while a bucket of mop water was emptied straight over his head. The woman holding the bucket was the hospital's head nurse. The reason was that he had gone back and cleaned the second-floor corridor after she told him to get out of it, and she wanted the whole courtyard to see what happened to a cleaner who opened his mouth. People in white stood in a ring around him. Some laughed, some folded their arms, some raised a hand to their mouths, and not one of them stepped forward. The man made no sound. He didn't stand, didn't resist. He shut his eyes, took the whole bucket, then sat there without moving, hands on his knees, water running down the badge on his chest that carried 2 words, Eli Ward. Nobody in that courtyard knew it wasn't his real name, or that the building behind them, the hospital sign they walked past every morning, and the paycheck they collected at the end of every month, all belonged to the man sitting soaked at their feet. In Southside Chicago, people lowered their voices at the name Santoro, and Rafael Santoro had traded away 33 years of those lowered voices for an afternoon exactly like this one, because he wanted to see for himself how people treated a man who had nothing in his hands. Then someone stepped out of the crowd in white. She walked against the direction everyone else was standing, crouched down beside him, and did the one thing the entire hospital had just watched and refused to do. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone you care about. And please subscribe to our channel, so there's another story worth listening to waiting for you every day. It had begun 3 hours earlier, and it had begun with something very small. At 9 o'clock that morning, Eli Ward finished mopping the second-floor corridor, wrung out his mop, set the yellow wet floor sign at the entrance to the passage, then pushed his cart toward the waiting area. Close to 10 o'clock, someone stepped out of the elevator carrying a cup of coffee, bumped into another person, and spilled half the cup directly in front of the elevator doors. That person kept walking. Eli heard the sound, turned around, and had just begun lifting the lid from his bucket when Priscilla Vance came out from behind the nurse's station. She told him to get out of there. She said the floor had already been cleaned, and she didn't want to see a bucket of water sitting in the middle of the passage while the inpatient ward was taking patients downstairs for imaging. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He closed the lid, pushed his cart away, and he truly did leave, walking all the way down the corridor to the admissions area, where he began cleaning instead. 15 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and an elderly woman stepped out leaning on a cane. She took 2 steps, then planted the tip of her cane directly in the streak of coffee. The cane slipped, and her whole body tilted sharply to the right. She managed to catch hold of the railing along the wall. Her cane struck the floor with a hard sound, and she stood there for nearly 5 seconds, one hand gripping the railing, the other pressed against her chest. At the nurse's station, only 9 steps away, 2 people were entering data. Neither of them looked up. Neither of them hurried over. Eli came from the far end of the corridor, picked up the cane, handed it back to her, and asked if she was all right. The elderly woman said she was fine, only a little frightened, and then she continued on her way. He stood watching until she turned into the examination room. Then he opened his bucket, knelt down, and cleaned the streak of coffee. He cleaned it carefully, dried it completely with a second cloth, then placed the yellow sign directly over the spot. He had just finished setting the sign down when Priscilla came out. She looked at the bucket, looked at the sign, then looked at him. She asked whether she had said something to him at 10 o'clock. He said she had. She asked why. Then, he was still there. He didn't mention the cane slipping. He didn't say that someone had nearly fallen in that exact place. Didn't say that the 2 people at the nurse's station hadn't even looked up. Didn't say a single word about any of it. He only said, because the floor was still wet. Priscilla fell silent. She was silent for exactly 3 seconds, and those 3 seconds lasted longer than every sentence she had spoken to him over the past 2 weeks. Then she said, "Fine." She said, "Fine. Very good," and told him to take that bucket out to the front courtyard. He asked what he was supposed to do with it there. She told him he would find out when he got outside. 12:20 was the middle of the shift change. At that hour, the front courtyard of Cecilia Medical Center was the busiest place on the entire campus. The morning shift was leaving, the afternoon shift was coming in, several people were waiting for rides, and several others sat on the steps with half-eaten lunches resting in their laps. Eli pushed his cart outside and set the bucket on the concrete in front of the entrance. Priscilla stood on the highest step, and she called his name, loudly. She said there was something she wanted to address that day, and she wanted everyone to hear it, not just one person. She said a floor could always be cleaned again, but the other thing couldn't. She said that other thing was knowing where you stood and knowing who gave the orders there. She said anyone who came into that building to work had to know their place. Those who learned quickly suffered less, and those who couldn't figure it out for themselves needed someone to show them. A few people stopped to listen, then others stopped as well. In less than a minute, a circle of people in white uniforms had formed around that patch of concrete, standing just close enough to hear clearly and see clearly. Eli said nothing. The concrete in front of the entrance was already clean. There was nothing there to mop, but he dipped his cloth into the water anyway, lowered himself to the ground, and moved his hand back and forth, one stroke at a time, just as he did every day. He didn't look up. He heard someone laughing behind him. He also heard someone quietly asking the person beside them what was happening. Priscilla walked down from the steps. She took 3 steps toward the bucket beside him. Then she bent down, gripped the rim of the bucket with both hands, lifted it from the ground, and tilted it. When Priscilla threw the water over him, Rafe didn't flinch. He merely raised his head slowly, his eyes locking directly onto hers with a gaze so cold and still that it was as though he were looking at a corpse. The silent menace in that stare made Priscilla recoil instinctively, stumbling half a step backward as her trembling hands dropped the bucket. Rafe didn't say a word. He simply wiped the water from his face with deliberate calm, a threatening half-smile curling at the corner of his mouth. The circle of people stood there for about 10 seconds, then began to disperse. Some turned away first, while others lingered for one more look. And at that very moment, someone in a white uniform came out through the staff entrance. She walked in the opposite direction from everyone else. She passed 2 people heading back toward the gate, past 3 others talking together on the steps, and she didn't stop anywhere along the way. She walked straight to where he was sitting. She took off her outer coat, draped it over his shoulders, then lowered herself onto the wet concrete beside him, took the second cloth from his cart, and began to wipe the ground. He told her not to do it, that her clothes would get soaked. She said clothes could be washed. On the steps, Priscilla stopped. She called the woman's name, pronouncing every word clearly. Rosie Carter. She asked if Rosie knew what uniform she was wearing. She said nurses didn't sit on the ground and clean floors alongside the custodial staff, that it was the same in every hospital, and that everyone there had a job of their own. Then she said that if Miss Carter had that much time to spare, she would find something for her to do. Rosie looked up and said, "Yes, ma'am." Then she lowered her head and finished wiping away the water that remained. Priscilla watched for a few more seconds, then went inside. The last person in the courtyard left as well. The 2 of them finished cleaning that patch of concrete in silence. When they were the only ones left, she told him to wait there, then went straight down to the laundry room on the 1st floor. 5 minutes later, she came back carrying a dry gray uniform that was still neatly folded and a small towel. She handed him both. He took the uniform but didn't take the towel, so she held it out again and told him to dry his head because mop water made the skin itch if it stayed there too long. He took the towel. She stood there looking at him for a moment, then said something in a voice that wasn't loud but was very clear. She told him he wasn't anyone's servant there. He looked up at her. She said everyone there worked to earn a living, and whether they wore white or gray made no difference, and no one had the right to do what that woman had just done. Then she looked at her watch, said she was late for the 3rd floor inventory check, and left. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Human Resources opened an incident report because too many people had witnessed what happened at noon for anyone to pretend it hadn't happened. The report was placed on Gerald Whitmore's desk. He read it, then asked how many people had witnessed the incident. The Human Resources representative said there was no way to count them because it had happened during the shift change. Whitmore sat in silence for a while. Then he said he would handle it. He didn't summon Priscilla. He didn't summon anyone at all. He picked up his pen and wrote in the report that this had been an incident arising during the cleaning of the front courtyard, that there had been no injuries and no damage to property, and that he recommended the 2 parties meet for internal mediation, bringing the matter to a close. He didn't do it because he cared about Priscilla Vance. He did it because if the matter became an official disciplinary case, then within a week someone from outside would come and sit inside that building, and that person wouldn't ask only about a bucket of water in the front courtyard. At 4 o'clock, someone from Human Resources called Eli downstairs, handed him the report, and asked whether he wanted to request further action, because if he did, he would have to write it on the final line and sign his name. The representative added that he had the right to make that request and the right to take the matter further if he wished. Eli read the entire document. He knew exactly what would happen if he signed that line. Someone would open both parties' personnel files, read them from beginning to end, call former employers to verify their histories, check social security numbers, and compare every document. And the name Eli Ward couldn't survive that kind of scrutiny even once. It was nothing more than 2 words printed on a card, and there was nothing behind them. He set the paper down on the desk and said no. The Human Resources representative asked again to make certain. He said he wasn't requesting anything. The representative crossed out the final line, closed the file, said the matter was settled, and thanked him for his cooperation. Eli left the Human Resources office at 10 minutes past 4. In the first-floor corridor, he walked past Priscilla Vance as she stood reading the duty roster, and she didn't even bother to turn her head. She had done that in front of several dozen people, and she would still come to work the next morning, still arrange the schedule for the entire nursing staff, still call out the name of anyone she chose. He knew that he had just allowed that to happen, and he also knew that the person who would pay the price for the decision he had just made wouldn't be him. At 11 o'clock that night, in the most secluded corner of the parking lot behind the building, a black car sat with its lights off. Gino Farrell didn't get out. He lowered the window halfway, looked at the gray uniform, and the first words out of his mouth weren't a greeting. He said he had heard what happened at noon. Rafe asked who had told him. Gino said there were 3 people in that building who received a paycheck from him, and one of those 3 had been standing in the front courtyard at 12:20. Then he came straight to the point. He told Rafe to give him the word, and by the next morning, that head nurse would write her own letter of resignation, tell everyone she was moving to another state because of a family matter, and no one would ask another question. There would be no report, and no outsider would come to sit inside that building. He said it would be cleaner than all the paperwork Human Resources had spent the entire afternoon completing. Rafe stood beside the car, still holding the bag containing his wet uniform, and said no. Gino fell silent. Then he asked why. He said he didn't understand, because this wasn't about money, and it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about someone pouring a bucket of water over Rafe's head in front of several dozen people while he sat there without doing anything. And then, that afternoon, signing a paper saying he wanted no action taken. Rafe didn't answer at once. He opened the car door, sat down in the passenger seat, and closed the door behind him. Then he asked Gino whether he remembered why the building across from them bore that name. Gino said he remembered. Rafe told him to listen to the story one more time. He said that when he was 12 years old, his mother had been taken to a private hospital on the west side of the city at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. He said they pushed her into the corridor, left her lying there on a stretcher, and told the family she would be taken inside once they had paid the full deposit. He said his father ran through the neighborhood trying to borrow money, knocking on one door after another, while Rafe remained there alone on a plastic chair beside the stretcher. He said there were 14 floor tiles between the foot of that stretcher and the emergency room door. He said he counted them for nearly 4 hours, over and over again, because at 12 years old, he didn't know what else to do, and because every time he reached the 14th tile, he thought that surely this time they would open the door. He said that by the time they finally agreed to take her inside, it was already too late. Gino said nothing. Rafe said her name was Cecilia. He said that 21 years later, he built a building, placed her name above its roof, and built it with clean money, 1 brick at a time, with transparent records, every tax paid in full, and not a single dollar taken from anywhere else. He said he did it so that what happened that night would never happen again in that city, not to anyone. Then he told Gino the real reason he was wearing the gray uniform. He said that 3 weeks earlier, someone had informed him that the hospital's patient assistance fund, the fund bearing his mother's name, was being systematically drained. He said he didn't need to know who was taking the money. He needed to know where it was going, whose hands it passed through, and who signed their name in each place. He said that if he walked into that building through the front door with the name Santoro on his lips, every drawer in the place would be cleared out within half an hour. Gino sat in silence for a long while. Then he asked, "What about the head nurse?" Rafe said she had nothing to do with the fund. He said she was simply someone who enjoyed looking down on those she believed stood beneath her, and people like that existed everywhere. Get rid of one, and another would appear the next day. He said the thing he needed to deal with was whatever stood above her. Then he said he needed 2 things. First, He wanted every financial record from that hospital, dating back to the day its first brick was laid, including supply contracts, payment records, lists of patients who had been refused admission, and every dollar spent from the fund bearing his mother's name. Gino said it would take 3 weeks. Rafe told him to do it as quickly as possible. For the second thing, he gave Gino a name. He said, Rosie Carter. Nurse. Newly hired. Gino picked up a pen and asked what he wanted to know about her. Rafe looked through the car window at the few third-floor windows where the lights were still burning, and said he wanted to know why, in that entire building, there was only one person who had walked in the opposite direction from everyone else. The new weekly duty roster was posted on the wooden notice board outside the nursing office at 7 o'clock Monday morning, and within 2 minutes, a crowd had gathered around it. There were cheers from those assigned to day shifts, sighs from those who had to work the weekend, and some people simply took pictures with their phones and walked away. Rosie arrived a few minutes later than everyone else because she had stopped by room 302 to bring water to a patient. She stood there reading the roster from top to bottom, through the entire morning shift column, the entire afternoon shift column, and the entire night shift column, then read it once more from the bottom up. Her name wasn't anywhere. In the bottom corner of the page, beneath the section for staff who hadn't been assigned a schedule, there was a line in small print that read General Support, and beside it was her name, Rosie Carter. She was the only person on that line. Priscilla Vance came out of the nursing office with a cup of coffee in her hand, and she spoke without even looking at Rosie. She said that today Miss Carter would push the supply cart from the storeroom up to the 3rd floor, then go down to the inpatient ward and change the sheets on every bed on the 2nd floor, and after that, recount the linen storeroom inventory because someone had counted it incorrectly the month before. Rosie asked a question very softly. She asked whether Priscilla intended to assign her to any nursing shifts because she had a nursing license and had been hired as a nurse. Priscilla blew across the surface of her coffee. Then she said that the week before, Miss Carter had chosen her own work in the front courtyard, so this week Priscilla would choose it for her. That was all she said. She offered no further explanation before turning and walking back into the room. Camille Doyle stood leaning against the doorframe with her arms folded across her chest, and she spoke just loudly enough for the entire corridor to hear. She said it was fortunate that even when a degree wasn't being used, it could still be hung on a wall. The whole room laughed. Some turned away to hide their faces. Some laughed openly, and 2 people didn't laugh but didn't say anything either. Rosie remained there for another 2 seconds or so. She didn't argue. She only said, "Yes, ma'am," even though Priscilla had already gone inside, then turned and walked toward the elevator. The supply cart was so heavy that Rosie had to lean her entire body into it just to push it over the threshold, and not one of the people who had just laughed stood up to give her a hand. That same morning, in the equipment storeroom on the 2nd floor, Walter Briggs was arranging a stack of cleaning rags on a shelf. He was nearly 70, with a slightly stooped back and hands that moved slowly but neatly. He looked at the name badge on Eli's uniform, then at his face, and said he had heard about what happened on Wednesday. Eli said yes. Walter didn't ask anything else about it. He simply handed Eli a roll of trash bags, then began teaching him the things that weren't written on the assignment sheet. He said Dr. Preston Hale in the surgical department was someone to stay far away from. If Eli saw him coming, he should move against the wall, not greet him, and not look at him. He said Mrs. Vance should never have to remind him of anything a second time. He said Doctor. Miriam Solis in the emergency department was a decent person, but she was so busy that she never had time to be decent to anyone for long. He said Mr. Whitmore was always smiling, and in 31 years, Walter had never met anyone who smiled that much and was still a decent man. Eli asked who else there was. Walter said everyone else, but there was no need to remember them because they wouldn't remember people like them either. Then he pushed his cart toward the door, glanced back, and said there was one more thing, the most important thing of all, and remembering it would spare Eli a great deal of suffering. Eli stopped and listened. Walter said that when a man held a mop in his hand, he could go anywhere. He said he could walk into a conference room while a meeting was in progress, enter the medication storeroom, or stand directly beside the director while the man was talking on the phone, and no one would mind. He said it wasn't because they trusted people like them. He said it was because no one ever bothered to look at them. Then Walter pushed his cart away as though he had merely spoken one more ordinary sentence among all the ordinary sentences of the day. Eli remained standing in the middle of the corridor for a long while, still holding the roll of trash bags, and at the far end of the hallway, a woman in a white uniform was pushing a heavily loaded supply cart toward the elevator without a single person offering to help her. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Eli pushed his cart along the second-floor corridor to empty the last few bags of trash from his shift, and when he passed room 214, he stopped. The door stood open by about a hand's width. Inside, an elderly man lay alone. The bed beside him was empty, and the bedside table held no flowers, no personal water pitcher, no cards, only a plastic cup and a laboratory report folded into quarters. Rosie sat in a plastic chair pulled close to the edge of the bed. She was holding the old man's hand in her lap and trimming his fingernails. She worked very slowly, one finger at a time, occasionally pausing to turn his hand toward the window so she could see clearly before continuing. The old man was telling her a story. He told her about the machine shop on the south side of the city where he had worked for 40 years. He told her the name of his former boss, told her that man had a hat he never took off, and told her about 2 men who had worked on the same crew with him, though he could no longer remember one of their names. He told her about a winter when everyone at the shop had to keep the furnace burning through the night because the machines had frozen. Then he returned to the story about his boss's hat, then mentioned that winter for the second time. His story wandered. He repeated one detail 3 times, and in some places, he stopped in the middle of a sentence, because he had forgotten where he was. Rosie listened. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't make absent sounds of agreement to hurry him along. She didn't say, "Yes, yes, I know." She asked questions exactly where questions needed to be asked. She asked whether the furnace had saved the machines, and when he said it had, that it had saved every one of them, and they were all running normally again by morning, she laughed. She truly laughed, so hard that she had to lean back a little, and the plastic chair gave a sharp squeak beneath her. The old man laughed with her. He said that if she didn't believe him, she could ask anyone, because that entire shop hadn't lost a single day of production. She said, "I believe you. I believe every word." She trimmed the last fingernail, brushed the clippings into her own palm, then took a wet cloth and wiped his hands clean. She straightened his blanket, raised his pillow a little higher, poured water into the plastic cup, and placed it exactly where he could reach it. The old man watched her do those things, then said something. He said that no one had entered that room all week without carrying a piece of paper. He said people came in, asked his name, asked his age, wrote it down, then left. He said he didn't blame anyone. He knew they were busy. Rosie stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Starting tomorrow, you wait for me. I'll only bring the clippers. I won't bring any papers." He smiled and said that would be just fine. Then he asked which department she worked in. She said, "I can work in any department, sir. This week, I'm going all over the building." He said that was good too, because the more places she went, the more people she would meet. She said yes, then returned the plastic chair to the corner, reminded him to press the call button if he needed anything, and walked out. Eli pushed his cart away before she reached the door. He went to the end of the corridor, stopped at the trash disposal area, and stood there for a long while without doing anything. He didn't think about Wednesday afternoon. He didn't think about the bucket of water. He didn't think about the duty roster posted outside the nursing office that morning. He thought about how she had just spent 20 minutes in a room no one else entered, trimming the fingernails of a man who would never be able to give her anything in return, and she had no idea that anyone had been standing outside the door watching. In 33 years, everyone he had ever met had been kind to him when they knew for certain he was watching. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Rosie stood on the stairwell landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors, the only place in the building where no one ever passed by, and dialed the number for home. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. She asked if he had eaten. From the other end came the voice of a child saying, "I did, Rosie. I finished all my food." She asked about his medicine. The boy fell silent for a moment, then said he had forgotten. She told him to go get it right now, and said she would wait. She heard running footsteps, a drawer being pulled open, and water being poured. She reminded him that after taking his medicine, he had to sit still for 15 minutes, not run, not climb onto any chairs, and not go outside into the yard. The boy said, "I know. You tell me 3 times every day." Rosie laughed. Then he asked if she would be home early that night. She said no. She had signed up for another night shift. He asked how many nights that made this week. She said 4. He was quiet for a while, then asked when she ever slept if she worked that much. She said she slept during the day, just as their mother used to. He said their mother had worked nights at the packing plant. Rosie said that was right. He asked if it had been 4 years. She said 4 years and 2 months. Then he asked why she had been working so much lately. She told him it was because she was saving money, and once she had enough, the doctors would operate on him. After the operation, he would be able to run, climb stairs, and play soccer. He wouldn't have to sit and watch the other children play anymore. The boy asked if she still needed a lot of money. Rosie looked down at the step beneath her feet for a moment, then said it wasn't much, that she almost had enough. He said he didn't need new shoes anymore because his old ones were still good enough to wear. She had to take a breath before answering. She said, "Toby, money is my responsibility. Your responsibility is to take your medicine on time and go to sleep at exactly 9 o'clock. He said yes. Then he asked if their father had called. She said no, then immediately changed the subject and asked if anything fun had happened at school that day. He launched into a long, excited story. She listened to every word, then said she had to start her shift and reminded him to lock the door. After hanging up, she remained in the stairwell for another 10 seconds or so, wiped her face with the back of her hand, then pushed open the door and stepped into the corridor, wearing exactly the same expression she had worn when she entered. At 7 o'clock that evening, Eli and Walter carried their lunchboxes into the staff dining room and sat at an empty table in the farthest corner. Before they could open the lids, a man from the administrative department walked over. He didn't raise his voice or show any irritation. He simply said that the dining room was crowded that week and that the custodial staff had their own area out back, beyond the receiving dock, where there was more fresh air. Walter asked whether that separate area had a table. The man said there were steps. Then he walked away. At the next table, 3 people continued eating while glancing in their direction, and none of them said a word. Walter closed the lid of his lunchbox and stood, and Eli rose with him. The receiving dock was at the rear of the building, beside the parking area for supply trucks. There were several wide concrete steps beneath a corrugated metal awning. Walter sat on the highest step as though he had sat there 1,000 times before. He opened his lunchbox, and as he ate, he began to speak. He said that in 31 years, he had seen the same thing everywhere he went. He said a uniform was a strange thing. Once a person put one on, people stopped looking at their face. They saw only the uniform, and after staring at it long enough, they forgot that there was a human being inside it. He said the frightening thing wasn't that they hated people like them, because hatred still required remembering someone's face. He said the frightening thing was that they forgot. Eli was about to say something when the back door suddenly opened. Rosie stepped outside with a lunchbox in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other, looking at the 2 men seated on the steps as though she had just found what she had been searching for. She asked if there was room for one more. Walter moved aside and invited her to sit. She settled onto the middle step, placed the lunchbox on her knees, broke the loaf of bread in half, then held one half out to Eli. He looked at the bread in her hand. She told him to take it because the loaf was too large for her to finish alone. He accepted it. She didn't ask which department he worked for, how long he had been there, or why the 3 of them were eating on the steps outside when there were still empty tables in the dining room. She asked whether he could eat spicy food because she had brought some of the pickled peppers her mother used to make, and she still had 1 jar left. Throughout the following week, Eli cleaned more floors than anyone required of him. He asked to be transferred from one area to another, asked to work extra hours, and volunteered for every place no one else wanted to take. No one questioned it, and no one noticed, exactly as Walter had said. He found the first sign in the basement supply room one morning when he was called downstairs to clean up a leaking pipe. As he worked, he saw 2 warehouse employees sitting there peeling labels from boxes of syringes and surgical gloves, then covering them with newly printed labels that still carried the sharp scent of fresh ink. He wrung out his rag right beside them. One man said those shipments had arrived in the summer of the previous year and had been sitting there far too long. The other told him to follow the instructions sent down from upstairs, because asking too many questions would cost him his job. The first man said those supplies were meant to be used in operating rooms. The other man didn't answer. Eli finished cleaning the area, and before going back upstairs, he picked up a piece of an old label that had fallen beneath a storage rack, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. The second sign came from the finance office on the 3rd floor. He cleaned the hallway outside that office for 3 afternoons in a row, always when the employees went to lunch, and the door was usually left slightly open to let in some air. On the 3rd afternoon, he heard 2 people arguing inside. A woman said she wouldn't sign the document. She said the patient in room 309 had stayed only 2 days and had never undergone an endoscopy. Yet the itemized bill included an endoscopy, and even the fee for the person who had supposedly performed it. The other person said the bill had been sent down from upstairs, so she should enter it into the system, and if anything was wrong, the people above them would be responsible. The woman said it was already the 4th time that month, and the insurance companies had paid all 3 previous claims in full. The other person said that meant there was even less reason to worry. The woman said there would be if someone came to investigate. The other person asked who would ever investigate, and that question brought the argument to an end. Eli continued cleaning that stretch of hallway for another 10 minutes, and during those 10 minutes, he heard 2 more room numbers. The third sign was something he didn't have to search for, because it happened in the middle of the admissions lobby every day, in full view of everyone. A man brought in his wife, but because they had no insurance, they were politely directed to a public health clinic 4 miles away. An elderly woman coughing up blood had no insurance, so she too was directed to the public clinic, and someone even printed out a page of directions for her. A young man injured at a construction site was sent away as well, because his contractor hadn't provided insurance. A mother came in with her child, but because they had no insurance, she sat in the second row of chairs for more than an hour before rising and walking out on her own. Eli stood there cleaning the floor, and he counted. In 6 days, 19 people walked through Cecilia's doors and walked back out without being examined by anyone. Not one of them was so poor that they weren't worth saving. They were only poor enough that this building didn't consider them worth keeping. He noticed something else as well. Not one of those 19 people was asked whether they wanted to apply for assistance from the hospital's fund. The name of that fund hung on the wall of the admissions lobby in gilded letters, yet not a single employee mentioned it even once. On Saturday night, in the parking lot, Eli passed a paper envelope through a car window. Inside were the piece of the old label he had found in the basement, the 3 room numbers he had overheard outside the finance office, the names of all 19 people he had copied from the admissions log, along with the date and time each of them had arrived, and a handwritten note containing 4 lines. Gino opened the envelope and examined its contents. When he reached the handwritten note, he stopped. He said these were 3 separate matters, and investigating all 3 would take time. Rafe said they were one matter. He said someone had purchased the expired supplies, someone had signed off on the fraudulent charges, and someone had created the policy that pushed poor people back out the door. He said all 3 trails led upward, and he wanted to know where they met. Gino asked when he wanted the results. Rafe said as soon as possible, but no one inside that building could know someone was looking into it, because if one person knew, everyone would know. Gino put the envelope into his briefcase, then added one final sentence before raising the window. He said that if those 3 trails truly met, the place where they came together would be very high, higher than Rafe imagined. The results came back at nearly 4 o'clock the next morning. On Sunday, Gino called, and he didn't offer a greeting. He told Rafe he should sit down. Then he said the 3 trails did converge, and they converged exactly where he had suspected. He said the first matter was that the expired supplies had been purchased at the price of new merchandise, and the difference had been funneled into a supply company registered in the name of Gerald Whitmore's brother-in-law. He said the second matter was that the procedures that had never been performed were billed under Preston Hale's professional authorization, and the insurance companies had paid for most of them. Then he paused for a very long time before revealing the third matter. He said the hospital's patient assistance fund, the fund bearing Cecilia Santoro's name, had paid out nearly $1,800,000 over the past 6 months. Rafe asked who had received the money. Gino said it had been paid out to 312 patients, with complete files, complete signatures, and complete records of the board's approval. Rafe asked where the problem was. Gino said the problem was that of those 312 people, 227 had never set foot inside that building. He said they were real names taken from the old records of a clinic that had closed 4 years earlier. The money had been approved, signed for, and withdrawn, yet not $1 had reached anyone lying in a hospital bed. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Gino had to ask whether Rafe was still listening. Rafe said he was. He asked who had given the final approval. Gino said Whitmore approved the payments, Hale provided the professional authorization, and all the 2 men had to do was sit together for about half an hour each month to finish everything. Rafe said nothing more. Half an hour later, the black car was parked in a corner of the rear parking lot with its lights off. and Rafe sat in the passenger seat with the file open across his knees. Gino waited until he had read every page before speaking. He said this didn't need to drag on. He said that if Rafe gave him 3 days, by Wednesday morning Whitmore would write his own letter of resignation, repay every last dollar himself, and Hale would accept a position in another state without needing anyone to see him off. He said there would be no noise, no paperwork, and no one coming to sit inside that building, and in 20 years, he had never mishandled a matter done that way. Rafe asked whether he remembered whose name was on that building. Gino said he remembered. Rafe told him to listen carefully. He said he had lived his entire life by the old ways, and he didn't deny that. But he said this building was different. He said he had built it with clean money, 1 brick at a time, with transparent records and every tax paid in full. He said that if he dealt with Whitmore in the old way, then 10 years from now, when people spoke of Cecilia, they wouldn't remember whom that hospital had saved. They would remember only that it was a place where people disappeared. He said his mother didn't deserve to be remembered that way. Gino remained silent for a long while. Then he said all right. They would do it according to the law, but Rafe needed to understand one thing. He said the way of the law was slow. He said everything in that file was a copy, and any lawyer could dispute copies by claiming they were nothing more than data entry errors. He said that if Rafe wanted to make certain Whitmore could never rise again, they needed the original records from the server, the original signatures, the trail showing the money moving from the funds account into the company belonging to Whitmore's brother-in-law, and at least one person from the finance office willing to come forward and speak. He said gathering all of that would take another 3 to 4 weeks. Then he said the most important thing of all. He said that if Rafe walked into that building now and revealed who he was, if he fired anyone, or if he allowed even one person to realize that someone was investigating, Whitmore would know within half an hour. And Whitmore would need only 2 hours to wipe the server clean, destroy the original records, call the people beneath him, and turn the entire matter into a system error for which no one could be held responsible. He said that when that happened, Rafe would be able to remove one man, but he would lose everyone else. Rafe closed the file. He sat in silence for a very long time, so long that Gino thought he hadn't heard. Then Rafe asked only one question. He asked who would be the one to pay the price during those 3 or 4 weeks. On the 3rd night of that week, Eli asked to take the night shift on the 3rd floor, and on the duty roster, the general support assignment had also been placed on the 3rd floor. After 1 o'clock in the morning, the only sounds left on the entire floor were the steady hum of the machines and the footsteps of 2 people. They sat down in 2 plastic chairs at the end of the corridor, beside the coffee machine whose sugar button had been broken since the week before. Rosie handed him a cup and said, "Drink it. It's cold now, but it'll still keep you awake." He asked how many night shifts she had worked. She said this was her 5th night that week. She had volunteered for them because night shifts came with extra pay. Then she asked whether he could sleep during the day. He said it depended on the day. She said her mother used to work nights too. She would come home at 4 o'clock in the morning, sleep until noon, wake up to cook, then leave for work again. He asked how long her mother had been gone. She said 4 years and 2 months. Then she told him what had happened. She said her mother had collapsed at home one Thursday morning, while Rosie was at school, and Toby was only 4 years old. She said the boy had sat beside their mother for 2 hours, believing she was asleep, so he covered her legs with a thin blanket and waited for her to wake up. She said that by the time she came home, their neighbor had already called an ambulance, but it was too late. She told the story in the same voice someone might use to describe a trip to the market. There wasn't a single word of complaint, not one place where she lowered her voice so that he would feel sorry for her, and not one sentence that began with, "if only." When she finished, she took a sip of coffee, then said their father had left 3 years before that, and now it was just the 2 of them. That was all. Eli sat in silence for a while, then he asked her one question. He asked whether she ever felt that it was unfair. She turned to look at him and asked what he meant. He said he meant that she had a degree and professional certifications, yet she was pushing carts and counting towels. He said he meant what had happened in the front courtyard the week before, when she sat beside him and the entire courtyard stood watching, yet she was the one whose assignment had been changed. Rosie was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "No one gets to choose their circumstances. People only get to choose how they treat one another." She said she couldn't choose that her mother had fallen, couldn't choose the condition of Toby's heart, and couldn't choose where Mrs. Vance assigned her. But what she could choose was whether, When she passed a room where someone was lying alone, she stopped to go inside or kept walking. She said no one could take that choice away from her. At that very moment, a call bell sounded from the room at the far end of the corridor. Rosie set down her coffee and went. Room 312 belonged to a young mother who had given birth 2 days earlier. She had no insurance. No family had come to see her. And that night, the maternity ward had only one nurse covering the entire floor. Rosie entered at 1:15. She came out at 4 o'clock. During those 3 hours, she gave up her break, helped the young mother breastfeed her baby, applied warm compresses, changed the sheets, and stayed beside her when the young woman cried because she was afraid she wouldn't be able to afford to raise her child. Eli stood at the end of the corridor and looked through the narrow opening in the door once. Then he stopped looking. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the day shift arrived, Priscilla Vance walked straight to Rosie with the timesheet in her hand. She asked where Rosie had been from 1:15 until 4 o'clock the night before. Rosie said she had been in room 312. Priscilla asked who had assigned her there. Rosie said no one had assigned her. They were short-staffed in that ward. Priscilla said that meant Rosie had left her assigned area without authorization, skipped her break, and performed professional duties beyond the scope of her assignment. 3 violations in a single night. Rosie said, "She was all alone, ma'am." Priscilla said everyone there was alone. She wrote something on the timesheet, then said that beginning the following week, Miss Carter would work 7 consecutive night shifts, and her night shift allowance for that month would be withheld to make up for the 3 hours she had spent working in the wrong place. Several people stood nearby and heard everything. No one said a word. Rosie looked down at the timesheet for a moment, then nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am." She didn't argue once. She went to get the supply cart and began her shift. In the corner of the corridor, Walter stood beside Eli and said quietly, "There. I told you. That girl doesn't know how to stand anywhere safe." He told Eli not to get involved. They were the people who cleaned the floors. If they opened their mouths, they would lose their jobs. And if they lost their jobs, they wouldn't be able to help anyone. Then he patted Eli once on the shoulder and pushed his cart away. On the 4th night of 7 consecutive shifts, Rosie was inventorying linens on the 2nd floor when her phone vibrated. The caller was the neighbor who watched Toby for her on the nights she worked. The woman said the boy was struggling to breathe. His lips had turned pale, and she had already called an ambulance. Rosie ran down to the admissions lobby before the ambulance even arrived. It came through the gates of Cecilia at 2:10 in the morning. Toby was taken straight into the admissions area, conscious and breathing through an oxygen mask, and after examining him, the doctor on duty said he needed an echocardiogram that very night for further evaluation. It couldn't wait until morning. They took the boy into a room farther inside, and Rosie was directed to the admissions desk to complete the paperwork. Gerald Whitmore was at the desk that night because he had stayed late for a meeting. He picked up the doctor's order, looked it over, then set it down, and said in a perfectly calm voice that the child's insurance didn't cover diagnostic imaging after hours, and according to hospital policy, a deposit had to be paid before the procedure could be performed. Rosie asked how much. He told her the amount. She stood motionless for several seconds. Then she said she worked there and begged him to deduct it from her wages. He could spread it over several months or take her entire paycheck if necessary. Whitmore said wage advances were available only to employees who had completed their probationary period. She said her brother was only 8 years old, and the doctor had just said it couldn't wait. Whitmore said he understood, and that the public health clinic had the necessary equipment and would open at 7 o'clock in the morning. She said 7 o'clock was nearly 5 hours away. He said he was very sorry, then turned to the employee behind the desk and instructed them to prepare the transfer papers. Rosie placed both hands on the counter, and for the first time since she had entered that building, her voice broke. 5 steps away, the man in the gray uniform stood beside his cart. He had been there since the ambulance came through the gates. He took his hand from the cart handle, stepped forward, and spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "Take the boy for the echocardiogram right now. The money can be dealt with afterward." Everyone at the admissions desk froze. It wasn't because of what he had said, but because of the voice that had said it. A voice that didn't ask, plead, or make a request. The voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to repeat himself. Whitmore turned to look at him and frowned. The frown of someone who had just heard something that didn't match the clothes of the man standing before him. He asked who Eli was. Rafe stepped closer, towering over Whitmore's side. He leaned toward Whitmore's ear, his voice deep and low, yet cold enough to cut to the bone. Get that child in for a cardiac scan immediately. If he suffers any complications before 7 o'clock in the morning, I promise you that both you and that director's chair will disappear from Chicago before sunrise." The sheer authority in his voice sent a chill down Whitmore's spine. He didn't dare utter a word in protest before furtively pulling out his phone and making the necessary arrangements. Once he was out of sight of the desk, he took out his phone, typed 4 lines, and pressed send. 10 minutes later, the telephone at the admissions desk rang. The employee on duty answered, then handed the receiver to Whitmore. He listened for about half a minute, his expression unchanged, then hung up and told the employee that an anonymous benefactor had just paid the child's deposit and that they should complete the paperwork for the echocardiogram. Rosie looked up. She asked who it was. Whitmore said anonymous meant there was no name. Dr. Miriam Solis came up from the emergency department, reviewed the order, and said she would take the case. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Toby was lying in room 401, stable and asleep, with a glass of water that someone had poured waiting on the bedside table. Rosie stepped into the corridor. Eli was mopping the stretch of floor just outside the room, and he knew she was standing behind him before she spoke. She asked him one question. She asked what he had said at the admissions desk 2 hours earlier. He said he had only said that they should let the boy have the echocardiogram. She said no. She said she wasn't asking what he had said. She was asking how he had said it. She told him she had been standing 5 steps away and had heard him clearly, and that wasn't the voice of a man asking for a favor. She said everyone at that desk had fallen silent, and Mr. Whitmore had asked who he was. Then she asked him that same question again, more slowly. She asked, "Who are you, Eli?" He leaned the mop against the wall. He turned around and looked directly into her eyes. He held her gaze longer than necessary, long enough for her to believe that he was telling the truth. Then he said he was only the man who cleaned the floors. He said he used to work somewhere people shouted all the time, so he had picked up that way of speaking. And as for the money, he didn't know who had paid it. The hospital probably had some kind of fund. Rosie continued looking at him for another moment. Then she nodded. She apologized and said she had been so overwhelmed that night that she was asking foolish questions. She thanked him for speaking up when he did, even though it hadn't made any difference. Then she turned and went back into the room with her brother. The door closed behind her. Eli stood alone in the corridor, his hands still wet with water from the floor, and he knew he had just done the one thing he would never forgive himself for. 3 days later, after Toby had returned home and the date of his follow-up appointment had been written in the book, Rosie carried a cloth bag down to the receiving area during her evening break. Inside were 2 containers of food, still warm and carefully wrapped in towels. She set them on the step between Walter and Eli and said she had cooked that day. There weren't many dishes, but it was real home-cooked food. Walter lifted the lid, breathed in deeply, then declared that in 31 years of doing this work, he had eaten every kind of boxed meal in the world. He had eaten boxed meals from 4 different hospitals, and he was prepared to sign a sworn statement declaring that this was the first time anyone had cooked for him instead of selling him food. Rosie laughed and said he was exaggerating. Walter said he never exaggerated. He only spoke slowly. Then he told them that when he was new to the job, he had once mistakenly mopped the floor of an operating room while it was being prepared for surgery, and they had thrown him out with exactly 3 words. From that day on, he had learned that in a hospital, the person who cleaned the floors should walk backward more often than forward. Rosie burst out laughing, and Eli laughed too. He truly laughed, so hard that he had to lower his head, and when he looked up again, even he seemed a little startled, because he couldn't remember the last time he had laughed that way. Walter finished eating first, stood up, and said he was going to check the 3 restrooms on the first floor before heading home. Then he left. The 2 of them remained alone on the concrete step. Rosie said she wanted to thank Eli once more. He said she had already thanked him 3 times. She said that night, when everyone at the desk had stared at her as though she were nothing but a nuisance, he had been the only person who spoke. She said she knew it hadn't changed anything, but she had been alone at that moment, and having someone speak was different from having no one at all. Eli didn't answer right away. He sat looking toward the trucks parked at the loading dock, and it was a long time before he finally spoke. He said he had once known of a case like that. Rosie turned toward him. He said a woman had been brought to a hospital near dawn, and they had left her lying on a gurney in the corridor. They didn't take her into a room or call a doctor, because her family hadn't paid the full deposit. He said her relatives ran everywhere trying to borrow money, knocking on every door in the neighborhood. He said there were 14 floor tiles between the foot of the gurney and the emergency room door, and a child sat there counting those 14 tiles over and over for nearly 4 hours because the child didn't know what else to do, and because every time the counting ended, the child thought that perhaps this time someone would open the door. He said that by the time they finally agreed to take the woman inside, it was too late. Very softly, Rosie asked who the woman was. Eli said he couldn't tell her. She asked what year it had happened. He said it was a long time ago. She asked what had become of the child. He said the child grew up and never forgot that his mother had died, not because of her illness, but because a piece of paper hadn't yet been signed. He paused, then added that on the night at the admissions desk, when Rosie placed both hands on the counter, he hadn't spoken because he was kind. He had spoken because he couldn't bear to watch the same thing happen one more time in his life. Rosie didn't ask another question. She simply sat quietly beside him. And after a while, she said she was very sorry. He told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she did, because people believed that once something was over, it was gone, but some things remained for a very long time. They sat there for another 10 minutes or so without speaking. Then she stood and said she had to return to her shift. At 11 o'clock that night, in the parking lot, Gino didn't get out of the car. He passed a thin envelope through the window and said the original records had begun to come in, but the person inside the finance office needed a little more time. Then he added one more thing. He said Rafe's decision to withdraw from the old business was making several people on the other side of the city uneasy, and those people had begun asking questions around this place. Rafe took the envelope and dismissed the warning with a single sentence. He said if they wanted to ask questions, let them ask. Then he went in through the rear entrance, and that was where the matter ended. No one mentioned it again. The following Tuesday, Dr. Miriam Solis submitted a request to Human Resources recommending Nurse Rosie Carter for the emergency department, with a brief explanation stating that she held all the required professional credentials, had 3 years of experience, and was currently being assigned work outside her field of expertise. A copy was posted on the bulletin board at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Rosie stood there and read it 3 times. Camille Doyle read it too, and she didn't say a word, something everyone in the corridor found strange. Priscilla Vance walked past, glanced at the notice, then went straight into the nurse's room and closed the door behind her. At 6:30 the next morning, the pharmacy team conducted its routine inventory of the controlled medication cabinet on the 3rd floor. The numbers didn't match. The actual quantity was lower than the amount recorded in the log. They opened the access record, and the 2 most recent entries bore Rosie Carter's employee badge code along with her signature, recorded on 2 different nights during the week when she had worked 7 consecutive shifts. By 7 o'clock, the entire floor knew. Rosie was summoned to the director's office. Whitmore was there, along with Priscilla, the pharmacy supervisor, and Camille, who sat in the corner as a witness to the inventory. Whitmore pushed the logbook across the desk and asked whether she recognized the signature. Rosie looked down. She said it looked like her signature. Whitmore asked whether it merely looked like hers or whether it was hers. She said she hadn't opened that cabinet on either of those nights, not even once. Priscilla said Rosie had been assigned to that exact floor on those exact 2 shifts, and she had been working alone. Rosie said yes. She had been working alone because Priscilla herself had scheduled her for 7 consecutive shifts. Priscilla said that only made it more impossible for anyone else to have done it in her place. Camille spoke up and said she didn't want to mention it, but on Wednesday night, she had returned to retrieve something she had forgotten and had seen Miss Carter standing near the medication cabinet. Rosie turned to look at her. She asked if Camille was certain. Camille said she was only saying what she had seen. Whitmore closed the logbook. He said that under hospital policy, any employee connected to a discrepancy involving controlled medication had to be suspended immediately while the matter was investigated, without exception. Rosie asked to see the door access records and the corridor camera footage. Whitmore said that fell under the authority of another department. She said she had a little brother waiting for surgery and couldn't lose her job now. He said he was very sorry, then pressed the button to call security. At 7:25, just as the entire day shift had arrived, Rosie walked out of the director's office and into the 2nd floor corridor with 2 security officers on either side of her, one of them holding the employee badge they had just taken from her. Everyone in the corridor moved back against the walls to let them pass. No one said a word. Some people turned their faces away. Others pulled out their phones. Camille stood at the nurse's station with a stack of files held against her chest. Priscilla didn't come out of the room. Rosie walked straight ahead with her back held upright and her eyes fixed on no one, and she didn't cry until she was outside the gates. In the middle of that corridor stood a man in a gray uniform beside a cart, a mop in his hand, and he watched everything from beginning to end. His phone was in his pocket. One call, a single call was all it would take to stop everything right there, to make those two security officers step back, to place the badge in her hand again, and to force everyone who had just pressed themselves against the walls to stand there and listen while he spoke. He knew that clearly. He also knew exactly what would happen over the next 2 hours upstairs, inside the room containing the server and the original files that Gino still hadn't finished retrieving. If Whitmore realized that someone was standing behind this young woman, he kept his hand inside his pocket. He didn't call. He remained where he was until the glass doors closed behind her, then bent down and continued mopping the floor beneath his feet. He mopped for a very long time, over a place that had already been clean for longer than he knew. That afternoon, the pharmacy supervisor went to the director's office and asked about filing a report with the regulatory authorities, because any discrepancy involving controlled medication was required by law to be reported within 1 business day. Whitmore said it wasn't necessary. He said the matter was an internal record-keeping error. The person involved had already been identified and suspended, and the hospital would handle it internally. The pharmacy supervisor said the report was mandatory. Whitmore looked at him and said that if they filed it, someone would arrive within a week, and they wouldn't open only the cabinet on the 3rd floor. He said they would open every storage room, every ledger, and every supply contract in the hospital. He asked whether that was what the pharmacy supervisor wanted. The man fell silent, then said, "Yes, sir," and walked out. Whitmore remained alone in the room, satisfied that he had contained the matter internally, just as he had buried the incident report from the front courtyard the month before, never realizing that with his own hands, he had just sealed shut the only door that might still have saved him. 3 days later, Eli stood outside the door of a 2nd-floor apartment in an old building 20 minutes from the hospital by bus, carrying a paper bag in one hand. Rosie opened the door, and for 2 seconds, she couldn't say a word. Then she asked where he had found her address. He said Walter had given it to him. She stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small. Toby was asleep in the back room, and a certificate of achievement was still fastened to the refrigerator door with 4 pieces of tape. Eli placed the paper bag on the table. Inside were some groceries and a box of tea. She said he didn't have to do that. He said he had been passing by, so he stopped in. She poured him a glass of water and sat in the chair across from him, and for a long while, neither of them said anything. Then she told him Toby's surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks from then. She said everything had been arranged. The date had been set. The operating room had been reserved, and the only thing still missing was the money. She said she had managed to save almost enough. There was only a portion left, and she had calculated that 2 more months of night shifts would cover it. Then she said she no longer had any night shifts to work. She said she had called 4 other places in 3 days, and every one of them had asked why she had left her previous job, but she didn't know how to answer in a way that would make them believe her. She said she had never opened that medication cabinet. He said he knew. She said, "No, you don't understand. I don't need someone to believe me. I need a piece of paper that proves it, and that paper is in the hands of the very people who just threw me out." Then she fell silent. She sat perfectly straight, both hands resting on the table, and she didn't cry. Eli made no promises. He didn't say everything would be all right, didn't say he would help, and didn't tell her not to worry. He simply stayed. He sat there for nearly an hour, finished his glass of water, listened as she told him Toby had eaten 2 bowls of food that day, listened as she told him the neighbor had lent them a fan, and listened even to the silences in between. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. At the threshold, she looked up and thanked him for coming, then said that all week he was the only person who had knocked on that door. They were standing closer than people ordinarily did. He lifted his hand, and his fingers touched the hair at her temple, very gently. She didn't pull away. For one moment, they both leaned toward each other. Then she placed her hand against his chest and pushed him back. Only a very slight push, just enough to stop what was about to happen. She took half a step away. She said she was sorry. He said it was all right. She said it wasn't because of him. Then she said that right now, she didn't have the right to love anyone. She said there was an 8-year-old child in that apartment waiting for heart surgery, and every hour she gave to anything else was an hour she took away from him. She said when he could stand on his feet again, when she had found another job, and when she could look into the mirror without seeing someone who had just been marched out through the gates in front of 100 people, then perhaps they could think about it. She said all of it in a calm voice, and it was that calmness that left him unable to say a word. He nodded. He said he understood. He told her to take care of Toby and leave everything else where it was for now. Then he walked down the stairs, and she stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared from sight. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, his phone vibrated. Gino said he had obtained it. He said an order had been issued from the top to erase all surveillance footage from the third-floor medication cabinet area for those 2 nights, but that order hadn't reached the backup server in the basement utility room, probably because no one in that building even remembered it existed. He said the good news was that during both nights, Rosie Carter hadn't entered the medication cabinet area at all, not even once, and she had been in other parts of the floor during the exact time periods recorded in the logbook. He said the footage was enough to clear her name. Rafe asked about the person who had opened the cabinet. Gino paused, then said that was the bad news. He said someone had entered the medication cabinet area at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning on both nights, but the camera was mounted high and pointed straight down the length of the corridor. The person had stayed close to the wall with her head lowered, and neither recording showed her face for even a single second. All he could say with certainty was that it was a woman of average build, wearing white, nothing more. Then he gave Rafe the final piece of information. He said the footage could prove that Rosie was innocent, but it couldn't reveal who had harmed her. On Monday morning, Dr. Miriam Solis opened her mailbox and found an envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a memory card and a sheet of paper bearing exactly 2 printed lines, identifying the time frames she needed to review and the location of the camera. She watched everything in 15 minutes, watched it a second time, then took the card and went straight to the director's office. She said she didn't care who had sent it. She said that on both nights for which Nurse Carter had been blamed, she hadn't entered the medication cabinet area even once, and there was footage showing her in other parts of the building at the exact times recorded in the log. She said that if the hospital wanted to keep the matter internal, that was fine, but they had to reinstate the woman that very day. Otherwise, she would personally send the card wherever it needed to go. Whitmore picked up the paper and studied it for a very long time. At last, he said it was an unfortunate record-keeping error, that the hospital always protected its employees, and he signed the order withdrawing Rosie's suspension that very morning. Not a single word of apology was spoken. Rosie received her employee badge back at 10:15, and by 11 o'clock, she was back on duty. At 11:40 the following morning, in the admissions waiting area, a man of about 50 sitting in the third row of chairs began to cough. He had arrived that morning without insurance and had been directed to the public health clinic, but he had remained there because he had no transportation. He coughed again, then raised a hand and pulled open his collar. 2 nurses behind the desk glanced at him before turning back to their computer screens. Rosie was pushing her cart past when she stopped. She looked at his face, then walked over. She asked if he was having difficulty breathing. He nodded. She saw red patches spreading across the skin of his neck and chest. His lips and eyelids were swelling rapidly, and when he tried to draw breath, a wheezing sound came from his throat. She asked whether he had just eaten or taken anything. He said he had just swallowed the pain medication someone had given him, and he had never taken that kind before. Rosie turned and shouted, her voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. She said it was anaphylactic shock, told them to call for emergency assistance, and ordered someone to bring the emergency medication kit immediately. One of the nurses at the desk said she needed to check whether the patient had been registered. Rosie said, "Now," and something in her voice made the other woman leap to her feet. Rosie helped the man lie down on the floor, raised his legs, loosened his collar, knelt beside him, and kept his airway open. The medication kit arrived in less than a minute. She carried out every step in one unbroken sequence, without pausing for even a second, then wrote the time in pen on the back of her hand. She called for oxygen. She ordered an IV line. She said loudly enough for everyone around her to hear that he needed constant monitoring and that they were to call her immediately if his condition didn't improve. Dr. Solis came running just as the wheezing began to ease. She examined the patient, asked Rosie what she had done, listened as Rosie gave her report in exactly 3 sentences, then nodded and said to continue and move him into the emergency room. 10 minutes later, the swelling in his lips had begun to subside, and he was able to say his own name. Solis stood in the middle of the lobby, turned to look across the entire admissions area, and said loudly that this man had entered the building at 8 o'clock that morning, had been sitting in that chair for nearly 4 hours, and if Nurse Carter had walked past him as everyone else had done, they would be doing something entirely different now. She said Rosie had made the correct assessment and taken the correct action from the very first minute. No one said a word. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Priscilla Vance placed a written report on Whitmore's desk, stating that Nurse Rosie Carter, assigned to General Support Services, had independently performed a medical procedure on an unregistered individual, outside the scope of her assigned duties, and without a physician's order. After reading it, Whitmore sat in silence for a while. He didn't fire her, because he had signed the order reinstating her only the day before, and if he dismissed her now, someone would ask why. Instead, he did something else. He signed an order rejecting Dr. Solis's recommendation to transfer her to the emergency department, stripped her of all patient care privileges, and restricted her strictly to cleaning and warehouse duties. Walter Briggs was mopping just outside the office at the time, and he pushed the door open and stepped inside. He said he would like permission to say one thing. He said he had done this work for 31 years, had watched many people die in waiting rooms like that one, and that morning he had been standing 10 steps away. He said that if someone in this hospital could have her hands tied for saving a human life, he would like to know in advance, so he could still find a way to look at himself in the mirror. Whitmore stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Briggs, you're a janitor, and your contract is renewed annually, just like everyone else's. You would do well to remember that." Walter stood straight and said, "Yes, sir, I remember." Then he turned, walked out, and closed the door behind him. The notice went out at 7 o'clock on Thursday morning, announcing that the owner had returned to the country and would be at the hospital at 10. The entire building was thrown into a frenzy. The floors were polished again from the first floor to the 4th. Whitmore summoned every department head to rehearse where they would stand, who would stand where, who would shake hands first, and who would say what. Priscilla made the entire nursing staff change into new uniforms. Camille rushed out to buy flowers. At 9:50, the employees formed 2 lines along the main lobby. Whitmore stood at the front and adjusted his tie 3 times, with Preston Hale beside him. Rosie stood at the very end of the line near the side corridor door, holding a stack of supply records in her arms, because that was the only work they still allowed her to do. At exactly 10 o'clock, no car pulled up outside the main entrance. The door that opened was the one leading from the rear corridor near the supply room, and the man who emerged from it was wearing a black suit. Gino Farrell followed half a step behind him, carrying a briefcase. For the first 3 seconds, no one understood what was happening. Then someone uttered something very softly, and the name Eli ran down the corridor like a crack splitting through stone. Whitmore couldn't say a word. He had spent the entire morning rehearsing a greeting, and now he could only stand there with no idea where to put his hands, his eyes traveling from the man's face down to the suit, and then back up again. Hale took half a step backward, retreating in the way a man does when he has suddenly remembered what he said and in whose presence he said it. Priscilla Vance remained standing straight. She didn't step back or move, but within seconds, all the blood drained from her face, because she was the only person in that building who immediately understood whose head she had emptied a bucket of water over 4 weeks earlier. Camille dropped the bouquet. At the end of the line, the files slipped from Rosie's hands and fell to the floor, sending papers sliding in every direction, but she didn't bend down to pick them up. He walked to the center of the lobby and stated his name only once. Then he began his work. He called Gerald Whitmore's name. He said Whitmore's contract was terminated effective immediately, and that every record related to the 227 fraudulent aid claims made against the fund, bearing his mother's name, had been turned over to the investigators at 6 o'clock that morning, along with the expired supply contracts and the trail of money leading to the company owned by Whitmore's brother-in-law. Whitmore opened his mouth and said he needed to call his attorney. He told him that he should. He called Preston Hale's name and said Hale's employment also ended that day, and that the procedures which had never been performed but bore his professional authorization were included in the same collection of evidence. Then he called Priscilla Vance. He said she was being dismissed, and he stated the reasons clearly before the entire lobby. He said the first was what had happened in the front courtyard 4 weeks earlier, between shifts, in front of several dozen people inside that building. Then he said he didn't need a single witness, because he was the man who had been sitting there. He said the second reason was the chain of disciplinary reports she had filed against one of her subordinates during those 4 weeks. Every one of them remained intact in the system, and when they were read from beginning to end, no one could mistake them for management any longer. Then he added one more thing. He added that as for the medication cabinet on the 3rd floor, the backup footage combined with the biometric door logs clearly proved the perpetrator entered using credentials issued directly under Priscilla's orders, and a formal investigation with law enforcement was now underway. From that day forward, no one in that hospital would be dismissed on the strength of a feeling. Priscilla said nothing. She simply stood there until security arrived. He appointed Dr. Miriam Solis as medical director, and he gave the reason in a single sentence. She was the only person in that building who had dared to carry evidence upward against those above her. He called Walter Briggs and told him that beginning that day, he would serve as head of employee support, overseeing the entire cleaning, storage, and logistics staff. His salary would be adjusted to management level, and he would never have to push a cart again. Walter stood motionless for a very long time before saying, "Thank you, son," and his voice broke on the final word. Then he called Rosie Carter. He said she was being fully reinstated. Every disciplinary report against her was being withdrawn, and beginning that day, she would be a nurse in the emergency department. Everyone in the lobby turned to look at her. Someone began to applaud. Rosie didn't step forward. She remained where she was among the papers scattered across the floor, and she spoke a single sentence, not loudly, but in that utterly silent lobby. Everyone heard her clearly. She said the man who had eaten with her on the steps was named Eli. She said the man who had broken a loaf of bread in half with her, the man who had sat in her home for an hour without making a single promise, was named Eli, and only now did she understand that Eli had never existed. He said the name was false, but everything he had told her was true. She asked him again, her voice beginning to tremble. She asked about the night in the 4th floor corridor. She said she had asked him directly, had given him a chance, and he had put down his mop, turned around, looked straight into her eyes, and lied. She said he hadn't avoided the question, and he hadn't remained silent. He had looked into her eyes and lied, and he had done it on the night her brother lay in room 401. She said she could forgive a false name. Then she gathered the files from the floor, held them against her chest, and said she didn't know what to do with the way he had looked at her. She turned away and walked into the side corridor, and everyone in that gleaming, freshly polished lobby watched her leave. No one applauded anymore. At 6:40 the next morning, Rosie had barely stepped through the employee entrance when Camille Doyle appeared with 2 cups of coffee. Camille handed her one and said, "I added extra sugar." "You take it sweet, don't you, Miss Rosie?" Rosie said she drank it without sugar. Camille said, "Then let me exchange it. Just wait 1 minute." And she actually ran back toward the cafeteria before returning with another cup. She called her Miss Rosie 3 times in the space of a single minute. In the elevator, 2 nurses from the day shift moved aside, so Rosie could stand between them. One asked whether her little brother was feeling better, said everyone on the team cared about the boy, and asked when he was having surgery. Rosie thanked her and said it would be in 3 weeks. The other woman said, "Please tell us if you need anything. Don't hesitate. I have a little one at home too, so I understand." When the elevator doors opened on the 2nd floor, someone held them for Rosie so she could step out first. At the nurses' station, someone had already written her section in the handover log in beautiful handwriting, carefully underlined, with an additional line at the bottom of the page, wishing her a gentle and easy day at work. She had just taken hold of the supply cart when a young nurse hurried over and grabbed the handle, saying, "Let me push it. You're in the emergency department now, Miss Rosie. Leave things like this to us." Rosie said she could push it herself. The other woman didn't let go. She simply held onto the handle and smiled until Rosie had no choice but to release it. By 9 o'clock, 3 different people had asked what kind of coffee Mr. Santoro usually drank. The first asked her in the corridor. The second asked in the changing room and also wanted to know where he liked to have lunch. The third didn't ask about coffee. That person asked whether he often mentioned anyone in particular. By noon, a nurse Rosie had never spoken to before pulled out a chair beside her in the dining room and said, "That day, when security escorted you outside, I was standing in the corridor and I felt so sorry for you. I was going to run after you, but I was afraid. Please don't be angry with me." Rosie said she wasn't angry. The woman said, "I knew you wouldn't be. You're the kindest person here." At the next table, The very two people who had stood laughing when Camille made that remark about the diploma hanging on the wall were nodding in agreement. Rosie finished her lunch, thanked them, picked up her tray, and stood. She walked outside, went all the way down the corridor, opened the back door, and sat alone on the steps by the receiving area, in the exact place where no one had wanted to sit 4 weeks earlier. She remained there for the rest of her break, and she never opened the cup of coffee someone had given her that morning. 4 days later, an article appeared on a local news site with a headline asking what was happening inside the Santoro family's hospital. The article never made a single direct accusation. It merely arranged the events side by side in chronological order. It said that a nurse who had worked there for less than 2 months had been suspended over a discrepancy in the medication records, then unexpectedly reinstated within a week without any investigative findings being made public. It said her younger brother had been admitted to the hospital during the night, and that an anonymous benefactor had paid his medical expenses within 10 minutes, on that very night, at that very hospital. It said the hospital's owner had disguised himself as a janitor for 4 weeks and had visited the nurse's private residence during that time. It said that immediately after he revealed his identity, she was transferred to the emergency department and every disciplinary report against her was withdrawn. The article ended with an open question, asking what everyone else in that building had to do to receive the same treatment. 2 photographs accompanied the article. The first had been taken from a distance and was slightly blurred. It showed Rosie sitting on the receiving area steps beside a man in a gray uniform, the two of them eating together. The second had been taken in the corridor and was clearer. It showed Rosie accepting an envelope from an employee of the finance department. The captions beneath both photographs stated that the images had been captured on hospital grounds. By noon that day, 3 other news sites had republished the article. By afternoon, people in the employee dining room had stopped speaking loudly. Some turned their phone screens inward when she walked past. As she passed the nurse's station, she heard only the final words of a conversation. Someone was saying, "No wonder." Rosie entered the changing room, closed the door, and sat there for 15 minutes. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Rafe summoned every member of the day shift to the main lobby. He never raised his voice once during the entire 20 minutes. He began with the second photograph, the one taken in the corridor. He said the envelope in the woman's hand contained a payment from the Patient Assistance Fund for an uninsured woman who had just given birth in room 312, and the woman in the photograph had been assigned to deliver it because she was already working on that floor. He displayed the entire file on the large screen behind him, 1 page at a time, the approval record, the signatures of 3 board members, and the recipient's own signature acknowledging that she had received the money. He waited until everyone had finished reading. Then he spoke about the photograph itself. He said it had been taken at 10:17 on Wednesday morning the previous week. He said the photographer had been standing in the doorway of the second-floor linen room, 9 steps away and slightly to the right, because that image could only have been captured from that exact position. He said the hospital had a surveillance system, and anyone standing in the doorway of the second-floor linen room at that precise minute would appear in the footage from that minute. He said he had watched it. Then he called Camille Doyle's name. She took half a step backward. No one was standing beside her anymore, because the 2 people who had been on either side of her had moved away the moment he mentioned the linen room. He continued without looking at her again. He said the email address used to contact the news site had been created on a computer in the second-floor nurse's station on Wednesday evening, after business hours. He said that after the hospital's attorney sent the news site a letter, it had turned over every piece of correspondence, along with the original image file and the chronological list of events that the sender had prepared for them in advance. He said the person who had compiled that list hadn't worked there since the previous week, and she had written it after leaving the building. The entire lobby was silent. Camille said she had only taken 1 photograph and hadn't written anything. He said that was correct. She had taken only 1 photograph. He said she had taken it while standing 9 steps away from her colleague, during working hours, in a place where she had no reason to be. He said her employment was terminated effective that afternoon. He said both women's files had been turned over to the hospital's attorneys, who would decide whether further action was necessary, and that matter was no longer within his authority. Camille began to cry. Not a single person spoke in her defense. He delivered his final statement more slowly than anything he had said before. He said that from that day forward, anyone who wanted to bring someone down in that building would need evidence, and anyone who wanted to use another method should remember that their method would leave evidence too. At 7 o'clock that evening, Rosie sat on the steps beside the receiving area. Walter came out and sat beside her, carrying 2 cups of tea. She said she couldn't understand it. She said she had worked there from the very first day, pushed carts, counted linens, worked 7 nights in a row, and had never asked anyone for anything. She said the most painful thing wasn't that they had accused her of stealing medication, because there were cameras and records for that. It could be challenged, and in the end, it had been settled. She said the most painful thing was that from now on, no matter how well she did her job or how many lives she saved, someone would always say they knew how she had gotten there. She said she had lost the right to be seen as a professional. Walter took a sip of tea, then said he would tell her a story. He said that 31 years earlier, at the first hospital where he had worked, there had been a cleaning woman whom the director praised in front of the entire crew because she had discovered a gas leak in the basement. He said that when she came to work the next day, the whole crew was already whispering that she had only been praised because she was always giving the director gifts. Rosie asked what the woman had done. Walter said she had quit 2 months later, and no one had mentioned that gas leak since. Then he said, "Child, people aren't throwing stones at you because you've done something wrong. They're throwing stones because you're standing in the very place they've been longing to reach. And because they can't climb up there themselves, they're trying to pull you down. That has nothing to do with you. It tells you who they are." Rosie sat in silence for a very long time, both hands wrapped around the cup of tea that had already gone cold. Then she said she knew. She said she knew, but knowing didn't mean it didn't hurt. He didn't send a message, didn't send flowers, and didn't ask anyone to speak for him. He came to the steps by the receiving area at 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, wearing an ordinary coat, sat down a respectful distance from her, and asked if she would let him speak. Rosie said she would. He said he had come to answer the question she had asked him in the 4th-floor corridor that night, and this time he would answer all of it. He said his name was Rafael Santoro, that he was 33 years old, and that he had been born and raised on the South Side. He said that in that neighborhood, Santoro was a name people lowered their voices when they spoke, and that reputation hadn't come from nowhere. He said his family had been in business for generations, and the way they conducted that business wasn't the way decent people did things. He said he wouldn't give her the details because telling them would serve no purpose, but he had no intention of hiding behind careful words. He said he wasn't a good man, and that for many years, he had made his living from things she wouldn't want beside her. Rosie said nothing. He continued. He said that the night he told her about the woman lying on a gurney in the corridor, he had told her the truth and concealed only one part. He said the woman's name was Cecilia. He said the child who had sat counting 14 floor tiles was him, that he had been 12 years old, and that he had counted them for nearly 4 hours while his father ran all over the neighborhood trying to borrow money. He said that by the time they finally agreed to take her inside, it was already too late. He said that 21 years later, he built a building, placed her name on its roof, and paid for every brick with clean money, so that what had happened that night would never happen again in this city. Then he said that 3 weeks before the hospital opened, he learned that someone was draining the very fund that bore her name, so he put on that gray uniform and walked inside, because it was the only way to see the truth before anyone had time to clean it up. He said he had never expected to meet Rosie. Then he said the last thing he had come to say. He said that if he had told her the truth that night, in the 4th-floor corridor, Whitmore would have erased every server and destroyed every original document within the next 2 hours, and not one of the 227 names used as a front would ever have been mentioned again. He said he had chosen those 227 names instead of choosing her. He said that when he set down the mop and turned away, he had known exactly what he was choosing, and he had done it anyway. He said he wasn't asking her to understand. He was only telling her the truth. Rosie sat in silence for a very long time. Then she asked him one question. She asked what he was trying to become now. He said he didn't know what he would become. He said he only knew that he was trying to walk away from the place where he had once stood, that the hospital was his first step, and that he wouldn't go back. She looked at him for a while. Then she didn't get up. She remained there, and the two of them sat together on the concrete steps until the night shift arrived. The following week, the case of an 8-year-old patient was presented to the Cecilia Fund Board. The board consisted of 5 people and was chaired by Dr. Miriam Solis, with 2 specialists, 1 representative from the finance department and 1 independent representative from outside the hospital. Rafe wasn't a member of the board, and he wasn't in the room. The case was reviewed according to the 3 criteria that had been published from the beginning: the urgency of the patient's medical condition, the family's ability to pay, and the expected effectiveness of the treatment. Rosie sat in the corridor throughout the meeting. The minutes were read aloud shortly before noon, bearing a reference number and the signatures of all 5 members, and the decision was to approve full financial assistance for Toby Carter's surgery, to be scheduled within 2 weeks. Dr. Solis handed Rosie a copy. Rosie read it from beginning to end twice, then asked whether he had arranged it. Solis said no. She said the board had approved 14 applications that month and rejected 3, and Rosie's brother's application had been the 9th case reviewed according to the date it was submitted, not according to any other order. She said that if Rosie wished, she could examine all 14 of the other applications, including the 3 that had been denied, because the fund's records were open to every employee and their reference numbers were posted in the admissions corridor. Rosie held the paper in her hands and sat down on a chair in the hallway. For the past several days, she had been preparing a refusal in her mind. She had revised it 3 times to make it shorter, and now she no longer needed to use it. That afternoon, she went home early and told Toby that he would have his surgery in 2 weeks, and that after the operation, he would be able to run. At 11 o'clock on Friday night, Rosie walked out to the employee parking lot after her shift. A man was leaning against a lamppost near the exit, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, and he stood there with the stillness of someone who had been waiting for quite some time. He didn't come any closer. He only asked whether she was Miss Carter. Rosie stopped about 5 steps away and said she didn't know him. He said that was right. She didn't. Then he said he had known her employer since before the man was old enough to shave. He said that for 20 years, people all over the city had tried every possible way to find a weakness in that man, and no one had ever found one. He said it was because the man had nothing to lose. No wife, no children, no one another person could take and use to start a conversation. Then he said one final thing. He said now he did. He said nothing more, didn't take another step, and didn't reach out a hand. He merely gave her a very polite nod and walked toward the main road. Rosie remained in the parking lot until the motion-sensitive lights turned themselves off. The following night, when she reached her apartment building, a car was parked at the curb across from the entrance with its lights off, and someone sitting inside. She went up to the 2nd floor, locked the door, and when she looked down, the car was still there. The next night, there was a different car in the same place. No one rang the bell. No one knocked on the door. No one called. There was only a car parked at the curb and a lighted window on the 2nd floor. On Sunday morning, Rosie sat at the dining table for a long time after Toby had gone down for his afternoon nap. She thought about the article, thought about the 2 photographs, and thought about the words someone had spoken in the changing room. Without realizing, Rosie was standing behind the locker door, saying how long a woman like her could possibly last beside a man like that. But those words weren't what kept her sitting motionless all that morning. She had been poor all her life, and she wasn't afraid of poverty. People had laughed at her and escorted her through the gates in front of 100 witnesses, and she had still found her way back. What she couldn't bear was the thought that someday someone might use her name to bargain with him, and he would have to choose. On Monday afternoon, she sent him a message asking him to meet her on the steps by the receiving area. He arrived on time. She didn't circle around the subject. She said she wanted to end things there. He didn't ask why at once. He sat down, and only after a while did he ask what had happened. She said nothing had happened, that she had simply thought it through. He told her to tell him the truth. Rosie was silent for a moment. Then she told him about Friday night, about the man standing beneath the lamppost, and repeated his words exactly. She said the man hadn't done anything to her, hadn't threatened her, hadn't touched her, and had simply walked away after saying what he had come to say. Rafe sat motionless, and the hand resting on his knee tightened. She told him that cars had been parked outside her home for the past 2 nights. He said he would take care of it that very night. She said she knew he could. Then she said that was exactly the problem. She said that all his life, he had never had a weakness anyone could seize, but now he did, and that weakness was her. She said she had spent 2 days thinking about it, and couldn't find any way to stand beside him without becoming something other people could use as a bargaining piece. He said he wouldn't let anyone hurt her. She said she knew. Then she spoke the words she had rehearsed at home, though her voice still trembled when she finally said them. She said, "I'm not afraid of hardship. I've been poor since I was a child. I'm used to it, and I'm not afraid of hardship. I'm afraid that one day someone will use my name to force you to yield on something, and you'll yield, and you'll lose. I don't want to be the reason you lose." He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was imagining too much, because they both knew she wasn't. He simply sat there for a very long time, and at last, he asked whether she was certain. She said she was. She stood, went inside through the back door, and didn't look back. The car parked outside her home disappeared that very night, and never returned. The man by the lamppost never appeared again either. Rosie didn't know how the matter had been handled, and no one said a word to her about it. As for Rafe, he didn't call, didn't send messages, and didn't ask anyone to come and persuade her. He didn't change her work schedule, didn't promote her again, and didn't send anything valuable to her home. He was simply there. On Wednesday morning, Rosie entered the changing room and found a paper cup of coffee on the table, still warm, without sugar, placed in the exact spot where she usually sat. There was no note with it. She stood looking at it for a while, then picked it up and drank it. On Friday morning, there was another cup just like it, then another the following Monday. One day, she arrived half an hour early to see who was leaving them, but the coffee was already there. In the evenings, when her shift ended and she walked toward the bus stop, she sometimes saw the silhouette of a man standing at the far corner of the parking lot, wearing an ordinary coat, never approaching, never calling out to her. She would board the bus, and by the time it passed that spot, no one would be there. One afternoon, Walter brought tea to Rafe's office and set it on the desk. He told him he had lost weight. Rafe asked him to sit down. Walter sat in silence for a while, then said he had something to say, and once he had said it, he would leave. He said he had spent 31 years watching people, and he had never been wrong about them. He said that girl hadn't walked away because she no longer cared. She had walked away because she was afraid. He said when people stopped caring, they felt relieved, but for the past several weeks, she had been working like someone wandering through fog, and every day during her break, she went out and sat alone on those steps, in the very place where the three of them used to share their meals. Rafe asked what Walter thought he should do. Walter stood and said he wasn't telling him to do anything. Rafe was the owner there, not him. But when he reached the door, he turned back and added one more thing. He said when someone was afraid, you didn't pull them closer, because pulling would only make them run. You simply stood still and let them see that you were there. 2 weeks later, Toby Carter was taken into surgery at 7:30 on Thursday morning. The operation was expected to last 5 hours. Rosie had been sitting in the third-floor waiting room since 6 o'clock, her fingers tightly interlaced. Her neighbor stayed beside her until 9, then had to leave. At about 9:15, the waiting room door opened, and Rafe walked in. He was wearing his old coat, not a suit, and neither Gino nor anyone else was with him. He didn't approach Rosie. He sat 3 rows behind her and said nothing. She turned and looked at him once. He nodded in greeting. She faced forward again. They sat that way for 4 hours. At 12:40, the surgeon came out and announced that the operation had been successful, that the boy's heart had been repaired exactly as planned, and that he was now being transferred to the recovery room. Rosie burst into tears in the middle of the corridor. She cried for the first time since the morning she had been escorted through the gates, crying so hard that she had to brace herself against the wall. Rafe stood but didn't go to her. He took a small cloth from his coat pocket, the one she had given him in the courtyard that day, handed it to the nurse standing nearest to her, and stepped back. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Toby woke up. Rosie sat beside his bed, holding his hand. The boy opened his eyes, looked around the room, then noticed the man standing near the door. He remembered him at once, because he had met him the day Rafe brought a paper bag to their home. He called Rafe by the name he knew, and asked whether he was still a friend to him and his sister. Rafe stepped a little closer and said, "Of course I am." Then he told him to go back to sleep, because he would feel much better when he woke again. The boy smiled and closed his eyes. Rafe turned to leave, but when he reached the door, he paused because Rosie was standing there. Though he had no idea how long she had been there, she had heard everything. 4 days after Toby was discharged, Rafe waited for her on the steps beside the receiving area at the end of her shift. He said he was asking for only 5 minutes, and would never speak of this again. He said that for all 33 years of his life, people had come to him because they needed something he possessed. He said she was the only person in his life who had ever given him something when she believed he had nothing, and that something was half a loaf of bread on those very steps. Then he said that no matter who she was, no matter what she had or didn't have, no matter whether she continued working there or left the city the following day, he would still choose her. He said he wasn't asking her a question, didn't need an answer that day, didn't need one the following month, And if she never answered at all, that was all right too. He said he only wanted her to know that he was there. Then he stood and went inside through the back door. A few months later, the nameplate outside the nursing office in the emergency department at Cecilia Medical Center bore the title Head Nurse, and beneath it was the name Rosie Carter. A small plaque hung on the wall of the admissions corridor, stating that no emergency patient would ever be turned away there because of an inability to pay, accompanied by the reference number of the fund board's decision and a link allowing anyone to read the complete approval record. Every morning, Walter Briggs made his rounds from the first floor to the fourth. He no longer pushed a cart, but carried a notebook instead, and he knew the name of every person in that building who wore gray. Toby had returned to school, could run again, and had begun complaining that his sister made him go to bed too early. One October afternoon, Rosie finished her shift and stepped through the back door. A man was sitting on the steps by the receiving area, wearing an ordinary coat, his hands resting on his knees as he gazed toward the trucks parked at the loading dock. He didn't turn around. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked down and sat beside him on the steps. Neither of them said a word. Some stories don't need an ending written down for us to know where they are going. A person's worth has never rested in the uniform they wear, but in how they treat those who can never repay them. And true love doesn't ask what we hold in our hands. It asks only who we are when no one is watching. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day we can gather to hear another story of kindness. How do you feel about Rosie and Rafael? Do you think Rosie made the right choice by giving Rafael another chance after everything they went through? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We always hope to hear the sincere feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and days filled with serenity and peace beside the people you love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.